Yeah, we can start.
Okay. Good morning and welcome to this morning's Revellion webinar on engaging millennials with gamified recruitment. Thank you for joining us and tuning in. My name's Jason Blake. I'm the Psych R&D Manager here at Revellion. I'm joined today by Sally Mucic, psychologist also, product manager and resident game guru here at Revellion.
G'day guys, welcome to the webinar. We look forward to your company and sharing some of our insights that we've learned along this journey of developing Theme Park Hero.
So just a bit of a flavour of what we'll cover today over the next 30 minutes or so. Focus is going to be around gamification at a general level, but then specifically looking at it as it applies to HR and also assessments. We'll discuss both traditional and game-based tests and identify and contrast different features between those. And then focus some of our attention on Theme Park Hero, which is the game that we've recently developed and launched. So looking briefly at the development validation and maybe some future ideas around that also. So at this point I'll hand it over to Sally, but I'm sure I'll chime in at certain parts as well.
Cool, we'll get through this, make it a bit conversational, a little bit interesting for you guys. So we thought we'd start with something that I have a habit of doing, and I'm sure some other people do as well. You look back at older movies and you kind of think about how do they view the future? What do they think it was going to look like? And one of these great movies, Back to the Future, everyone's, I think, favourite.
Great movie.
Yeah. Predicted a lot of things across a number of scenes. So if we look at some of the things that they spoke about way back in the 80s, they predicted that we'd be using biometrics, so scanning people's eyes or fingerprints and things like that to unlock mobiles and track people through that way. Microwave dinners, tablets. They had tablets in that movie. Hoverboards, which actually are real.
I've seen them.
They're very clunky, but they require a massive metal flooring type, so they can actually hover using magnets. Yeah. Wearables. How many people that use Google Glass, different types of watches, Fitbits. It's the latest rage at the moment, but back then, they're having dinner and Michael J. Fox was wearing the wearable. And I'm sure many of you can also relate to this because you might have kids also checking out their mobile phones or tablets at the dinner table, and you have to tell them not to do that. Video conferencing, power laces, which Nike's bringing out this year that tie themselves up, and 3D movies. And I suppose it's really interesting to look at this because the power of our imagination, what we predict for the future, can sometimes come true. So I'd like to flip it on the other side and kind of look at what did psychometricians back in the 80s predict? What do they think was going to happen? And there's a great quote here by Anderson, Inouye, and Olson in 1989, and they predicted that computerized tests of that time would be radically different. So the computerized tests of today, would be radically different to tests back then. And that's a bold prediction. So I guess they were dreaming about some of the kinds of things that we could be doing. And if we look over some of the things that did occur during the 90s, we actually went from paper and pencil to computerized assessments and really were able to standardize that a lot more. And then we were also able to get a lot more data and push that data out in different ways. So the management of the process was much more standardized and handled better, in effect. So some of their predictions actually did come true. However, if we look at where the web is at now and some of the market forces that are interacting with every facet of different types of industries and in different types of environments, we know that everything is turning towards the consumer. It's all about experience. So at the moment, we have the capacity to run different screen configurations, stream HD audio and video, have really different types of scoring process in real time, but a lot of these things actually haven't materialized for one reason or another. And test publishers have mainly focused on the back end in terms of some of the scoring mechanisms and also how assessments are handled.
Mm-hmm. My take on this too, to a certain extent, I guess I'm not surprised by this difference, but psychology as a discipline over time generally has a reputation of something that moves fairly slow, and rightly so to some extent. I mean, it's got to prove itself as a as an empirically grounded hard
sure.
science. Yeah, but at the same time, psychology can be easily applied in a very practical sense with HR tools, and as we've discussed already. So it's that scientist-practitioner divide, which I see as a very obviously difficult thing to bridge. But I think with enhances in technology and greater interest in the market and arguably also more money, I see that divide potentially being easier to bridge, you know, and this is an example of that.
And we're actually seeing it right now. And then one of these social forces, if you like, that really kind of looks at the experience of how you go through different types of processes or kind of, if you like, laborious or sometimes boring tasks is gamification. And the whole focus there is on enhancing experience. So if I was to ask the question, how many of you actually enjoy doing your house cleaning, or 90% of your work is quite repetitive as well? Most of you would say, yeah, sometimes it can be a little bit tedious because I'm doing the same thing again and again. But then if we look at people who actually play games, they perform repetitive tasks a lot of the time, and sometimes up to 40 to 80 hours a week, and they still come back for more. And why is that happening? So we really need to understand what's at the core of gamification and game-based processes that enables people to enjoy a repetitive tasks for prolonged periods of time, and then see how we can apply that to different environments. And that's actually what's happening right now. So to look at a definition, gamification is the use of game thinking and applying of game mechanics to engage users in solving problems. So really what we're talking about, the process of gamification is adding game mechanics to non-gaming contexts. And we're using the richness and the understanding that game developers have developed over decades and applying it to other environments, because they're very good at heightening that experience and making sure that their users are engaged. And really, you all would have heard about gamification. It's been talked about a lot everywhere. It's kicked off with this app called Foursquare. Basically, you could check into different locations. You could become the mayor of a restaurant, for example. You get special discounts and coupons, and you could show this off to your friends. So there was this kind of social angle or spin on it, and it allowed people to have this kind of, if you like, digital persona that they could compare with their friends. And businesses slowly realize that, hey, we can impact bottom line. We can actually get people to come into or frequent our restaurants or different types of businesses more and more because they want to show off or compete with their friends, or they get special discounts, and it's very timely, so it enhances their everyday experience. And this is kind of, if you like, the watershed moment of gamification. It's sort of kicked off with this app. Gamification as a Google web search term, or in terms of publications, is a recent phenomenon. It really kicked off around 2011 and started to kind of gain more traction around 2012, as we mentioned, with Foursquare and other apps that kind of came out at that time. But I think one thing that to note here is that it is a buzzword. People are using it very freely. And it can mean many different things across many different industries or different applications. And so I think it's important to recognize that gamification is a term that's probably gained a lot of traction as a household term that people can actually relate to and they understand it. But underneath all of that, human-centered design and psychology principles have been applied for a very long time. If you think about reward schemes or different types of point systems that shops have used for decades now, that is gamification itself. So it's existed for a very long time. It includes a number of different psychological concepts, especially regarding things like motivation, behavior, and personality. And if you look at Dan Pink's work online around motivation and purpose and engaging in purposeful activity and seeing results and being rewarded for that, it touches on all of these different types of aspects. But some of the key tenets of gamification is actually having these accelerated feedback cycles where we can actually provide feedback loops and increase the velocity at which feedback is provided, so that the player or the person engaging in this process understands what's going on, if they're doing the correct or the wrong thing. Having clear goals and rules of play that are well defined and that ensure that the player actually feels like they have control or they're empowered to achieve their goals is also very critical. One thing that's not on this slide is a compelling narrative, like a story arc and a narrative that engages players to participate and achieve those goals and actually feel like they're invested in this, like they're part of the story. And one of the most important things is actually having tasks that are challenging but also manageable or achievable by the player. And this is a concept of flow that people sometimes get in. We don't want people to be bored, but we also don't want to make them feel like they're overexerting themselves and they can't actually achieve their outcome. So these are some of the concepts of gamification, and it touches on a lot of different fields and uses this. And I suppose the term gamification comes from the fact that game designers or game developers have been best able to harness and mold all these together into a single experience.
If you look at current recruitment practices, and certainly if we're thinking about engaging millennials in this particular piece too, and you contrast some of these gamification tenets with what's embedded in current recruitment practices, let's say traditional psychological assessment, for instance, or even interview, you can see there's a real absence of these traits
For sure.
in there. Like, for instance, feedback, I think, is often fairly limited, if not completely non-existent.
Exactly.
Certainly immediate feedback, you don't tend to get that as a candidate applying for a job. And as a result, I think you're limited therefore in how you can demonstrate any form of learning as part of that too.
And what's the first thing that people want to know, JB, once they've done an assessment?
They want to know how I went.
How did I go?
Yeah,
exactly. So
right.
that feedback is critical.
And games actually allow you, and Sally, you touched on this, to get real-time feedback. So even when you're playing the game, it's not like you're getting feedback while you're in the middle of doing a psychological test. You have to wait till the end of that, and even then you're lucky to get anything.
For sure.
It's fairly limited too.
Sure.
And I mean, the goals remain fairly unknown or unstated too, and I think as a result it's very difficult to achieve any kind of flow state. And if we're looking to engage millennials, achieving flow would be the outcome we wish to achieve. So current techniques probably don't allow us to get there.
But I think if you look at the wider kind of wider experience of younger people these days, everything that they touch uses these types of different mechanics. Like even websites are now designed in an interactive way. You can play with different things. You can shift things around. Everything that they interact with, they expect a level of responsiveness, interactivity, that feedback, because that's all they know. They don't know any different. So when it falls apart in these some other phases of recruitment, or it doesn't feel complete. And even for us who have been around for a bit longer than, or haven't grown up with these kinds of interactive technologies, it's a nice thing to get that feedback. It's really lovely to actually know how I've gone and get that knowledge of what my performance was like, for example.
Indeed.
Cool. So bringing it back into examples of gamification and how it's been used. And I think this is really an important point that Jason touched on before, the absence of some of this in traditional psychometric assessment. And it goes back to that initial slide where we talked about that much of this has not been realised with traditional psychometric assessment, because in a sense we're still catching up with technology. And technology races so far ahead because we have to validate and make sure that we have scientifically rigorous tools. It takes us a bit longer. So some of the examples that exist in recruitment, Telstra just recently did a great campaign to attract applicants to their positions using JobJam. New Zealand Air Force, for example, had an issue with some identity issues where their applicants only thought that New Zealand Air Force, or the Royal New Zealand Air Force, was only providing positions for pilots. They actually have online missions that you can engage in, and it shows you all the different kind of parts of New Zealand Air Force that interact with each other, all the different positions and vacancies that are available. And they were able to achieve many more applicants and much more diverse range of applicants because that was online for people to experience that. IKEA has a culture survey. One of the most mentioned examples of gamification recruitment is America's Army. That is a full-on training first-person shooter that came out in 1998 and actually was live in 2002. We've had around 28 versions of that game then iterate since then, and it's been a massive success for them. in terms of attracting new talent. And there's a number of different examples there which I won't go through, but Reveal by L'Oreal, My Marriott Hotel, which actually achieved more impressions on their candidate careers page on Facebook than Facebook did. Plantville by Siemens, Path to Success by Accenture, and MI5 actually security services, a spy network in Great Britain, actually has a bit of a game where you can actually spot all these differences in a bit of a memory game. So I think one thing that's important to mention about all of these different examples, and there's many more around, they all fit in attraction. They're all used to attract applicants and infer a sense of culture and what it is that we do within our organisation. And in that part, they've been hugely successful. On the other side, in HR, we are now seeing gamification come into play for different types of aspects, predominantly in learning and development, which has been there for a while, but around performance management and getting feedback. So, for example, Work.com and Teamly, around engagement from Office Vibe, Achievers from a badging or a reward platform, and for example, Top Coder, which runs competitions for the best coders on behalf of Microsoft or Google, and they have real problems that they post online, and people apply and try to solve these problems. So these are all different examples of where gamification is being used, but as Jason mentioned before, absent in the assessment space. And in the next slide, I'd like to go through what the assessment space currently looks like in terms of the marketplace. Now, it's important to understand that there's a whole gamut or a spectrum of gamification and different levels of gamification applied across the marketplace. And these are just some examples. So if we start on the traditional side, you'll note here that we've got just the traditional psychometric assessment. We're not talking about paper and pencil being traditional. It's the online web-based assessment. That's got your Q&A type questions that are asked and you respond. And that is a traditional assessment with limited or no gamification applied. Then we move into this middle area, which is very interesting. These are kind of your modded examples of gamification, where we've got some aspects, certainly things like progression, progress bars, maybe some level of feedback, or a mechanic or a few mechanics from gamification applied to make it feel more enriching and more engaging. So if we look here, there's a great company from the US called Logiserve. They've got a situational judgment test where you get different types of scenarios and you can respond to those in terms of how appropriate certain actions might be. So this is deviating very much so from that traditional assessment where you have Q&A type questions or you have to respond in that way. And we have a scenario all of a sudden with avatars and people like that. Then moving along further, and you'll notice that as we move along further, these are becoming more and more game-like. We have the progression bars. We have how many questions you have. You get feedback. It certainly feels like a crossword, like a game. Another company called Connect Cube, and they offer these types of different services. So this is feeling more and more like a game and deviating from that traditional assessment base. Another company out from the US, you can see that this is becoming more game-like. And these gamification principles being applied here. It's much more implicit testing. The user might be able to guess what we're kind of getting at here, but it's not your traditional type assessment. And then we move to the far end of the spectrum, where we have Revelian's Theme Park Hero. Now, what makes this different to all of the other assessments is that it's got a full-on immersive narrative, as we mentioned before, that engages player in a position where they have to solve certain tasks, and uses a gamut of gamification principles and mechanics to actually further engage the player with things like feedback. And Jason's going to touch on this a little bit more as we progress further, but you can see the spectrum there, and there's a whole lot of variety. And it all depends on what your purposes are, what kind of assessments you want to use. But these are all the different kind of options, if you like, that are available in the marketplace.
What's important, I think, when you reflect on some of this, though, too, is that although the look and feel of these things are changing, there is still a fairly clear link to to the particular use or purpose of these things in a recruitment process. One thing that we've learnt recently is that idea of face validity remains quite paramount, certainly from a counter reaction point of view. So even those modded game-like mechanics, you can introduce those, but it still does remain relevant in that respect, or in fact it probably still needs to remain relevant in that respect, which is a balance between going too far in the game sphere, and that's a balance that we've tried to meet with regards to what we've done, and I think you can see that clearly in those modded. I think those modded type of tools actually work very well because they find a balance there. Without getting too lost, you don't lose that aspect of, okay, I'm doing this for a recruitment process. I understand why I'm doing it, and I remain engaged and invested in doing it.
Definitely, that sense of relevance is paramount, and we've already had some feedback from a sample of candidates that have gone through this, and they feel that the assessment's very relevant because they can actually see the purpose of it. And if you go too far, as you mentioned, Jason, then it just becomes about a fun experience rather than an actual test that I feel is valid.
That's right, and they start questioning, well, why am I'm sure this is fun and engaging, but why am I being asked to do this? It's silly, I'm applying for a professional role here. Yeah.
Cool. So I think one of the biggest challenges, and now we're going back to Theme Park Hero, which is kind of the main thing that we want to talk about here, is how do we actually use these game-like mechanics, or all the wonderful things we know gamification, the process of gamification can bring about, and embed them into a psychometrically valid and rigorous tool. That is a challenge in itself, because we're almost on polar opposites. We need standardization, we need rigor, and over here we need a fun and engaging experience that provides an immersive interaction for players. So I'm just going to compare and contrast the differences between traditional assessments and game-based assessments for a second, so you can actually see what the differences are here, and then it might give you an idea of what we've actually had to achieve or build to actually support or actually overcome the challenge that I spoke about earlier. So this is a traditional assessment. This is our cognitive ability assessment. This is an example question. And what happens with traditional assessments is that you'll be asked a series of questions. My responses on those questions are then tallied. I get an overall score in terms of how I've gone or performed on an assessment. And then that score is compared to a range of peers. And depending on how many items I get correct, or different metrics that we look at, I'm placed on a normative distribution. So I'm just going to skip back to this slide because we've gone ahead. So you can see that how that works in a very simple way. We have one input, a correct or an incorrect response that is then summed in different ways, and they might be weighted. There might be a lot more complexity behind this than a simple example like that. And then I'm being compared against a group of peers. Now, I'm going to take a very simple, well, not a simple game, but a game that you might all know and have spent some time on and been very frustrated at the point that you had to put it away for a bit of time. Candy Crush. Now we're going to try to apply some psychometric thinking to this and see how this might work as an assessment. This is a pure game. Basically, the main difference between games and psychometric assessments is that everything you see on the screen is a form of a mini test. So, for example, we might be interested in how the candidate acts in the game. Do they have a preference for certain colors? Do they have a preference for certain groupings? We can programmatically work out, is there a path of least resistance? So if they click on this move, it'll be much more favorable to them as a player. But did they resist enacting that move, or did they choose another path that was potentially more complex? Is that telling us something about them as a player? Do they have the foresight to be able to very quickly see which moves they need to make in what and in what sequence? What is their speed to act? Do they sit back for a while and view the whole scene as a whole, or do they focus on certain sections? So we can get a lot of information, if you like, about the player strategy and the decision making. So game-based assessments continuously capture stream data. And if you like, for our assessment, we capture data every 200 milliseconds. And at the end of a single playthrough, we might have up to or around approximately 10,000 data points for each single player. Now, each playthrough is unique Each player has a digital footprint, if you like, or a fingerprint that they leave. And then we use all of that data, and Jason will get into this a bit more, and try to psychometrically model this to get to certain outcomes and tell us something about this player that's much more deeper than we would be able to through a traditional assessment.
From my experience with Candy Crush, I suspect you're going to probably find personality indicators, emotion management potentially as well.
Definitely.
Rather frustrating, yes.
So what we've done here is really special. We've combined emerging cloud technologies, big data. You can see how much data we're just capturing through a few of those statements, and that's only the start of it. Psychometric frameworks and games in a very special and bleeding edge way. So in fact, we've had to build a proprietary analytics engine to be able to support all of this, and the technical side behind this all analyzes these thousands of data points that are coming in real time. So on the surface, it might look like a simple game that we've produced that's engaging and fun, but underneath that, there's a serious technology layer that provides employers with meaningful information about applicants. So now I'll just hand over to JB, who's actually going to go through some of the benefits of gaming and how this game was designed.
All right, thanks, Sally. You've touched on, I guess, the power in what we're measuring as part of these games now. 10,000 data points, if not more. I've seen more in some of the games that we've been tracking up to this point. So it does provide not only a very rich and insightful indication of candidate behaviours, but a very different way of looking at this too. So as a result, we're learning and adopting new techniques with regards to data analysis. Certainly our feedback and our surveys and our research thus far has also shown fairly favourable indications of candidate reactions to this type of stuff. So candidate reactions is something obviously very important in our mind as part of recruitment processes, as it should be for everyone. So some of our research to date has been, as I said, quite favourable. You've got about 80% of people indicating that they consider these game-like assessments to be better than standard employment tests. 75% are actually saying that they're engaging, if not very engaging, and a similar proportion also talking about it as being fun, a real fun experience. So that's specifically relating to our particular tool, Theme Park Hero, but also more generally when you look at game-based assessment too. So that for us is a very encouraging finding, given that's primarily one of the reasons we're doing this. We want to engage, as we're discussing today, the millennials, current generation.
But that face validity is critical. It needs the tool needs to feel purposeful, like they're actually they feel like it's actually providing an employer with some value in terms of their ability.
Indeed. Yep, for sure. So there's a few benefits of the game. Probably might take this opportunity now, if we can, before we use up too much more time, to start talking about Theme Park Hero. So Theme Park Hero, I guess, is our example or our attempt to kind of bridge this divide that we've discussed. So it's a first step in what would be, I believe, a long journey for us. It's been a very challenging, but I think quite inspiring step for us to make. So over the past 6 months or so, we've worked very hard. We actually put together quite a unique and diverse project team on this, which Sally led. We had 5 psychs, in fact, involved in it. So Sally, myself, plus a few others. And a number of other people, instructional designers. We work closely with a great team of software engineers and game developers and testers as well. So very unique in that respect, but I seem to think that project team did work well for a number of reasons, a lot of learnings from that too. We did, as we got up there, consume a lot of coffee. I put my hand up and admit that I contributed to that quite heavily. And we did play the game so many times that it no longer was fun playing the game. But we had to get it right as well. And obviously all that work was done online, but we would have gone through an Amazon forest of paper if we had been not paperless too. So what we did, in a sense, is our first place to start was we just canvassed people in the organisation, outside the organisation, for ideas for games with the thought in mind that we want to be building a game that actually does measure something that's useful in the workplace, i.e. it's actually predicting something of practical worth. So we basically canvassed and captured, maybe 100 different game ideas, some of which are displayed up here quite briefly. 6 months later, we ended up with Theme Park Hero, and that's where we are now. So a bit more information around this particular game, I guess. As Sally touched on before, this idea of a narrative we recognise is quite important. Certainly when you're looking at the current generation of millennials anyway, I think that's a key feature to ensuring they're engaged. So what happens with Theme Park Hero is you are placed in a narrative where you're actually the manager of of a theme park. So there's an overworld picture of the theme park there. It kind of reminds me, I reckon, of a mix between Dreamworld, SeaWorld, and maybe Movie World. Although that castle down there is kind of like more Magic Mountain, but that's showing my age.
My
it's not around
favourite
anymore.
spot is that polar bear and pool.
Yeah, probably. There you go, SeaWorld. It actually requires the candidate themselves to complete a number of different tasks, which I believe keeps the game quite novel in that respect. All up is around 10 minutes or so they're spending in there. Add in instructions and some tutorials, you're probably looking at maybe 15 or so. So it's brief, right? And that's another way of ensuring that candidates' reactions are fairly favourable to these type of tools, i.e. to keep it brief.
What's really awesome is that if you go on Whirlpool and you can see candidate reactions to different types of tests, they often moan and don't enjoy it. But the feedback that we've been getting so far on this is that people actually love it. They don't feel like they're being tested. They see the purpose behind it,
right.
and they're really enjoying it. So when we see comments like that, it just makes us feel very proud and happy that we've been able to achieve something like that also takes care of candidates, but also the employer.
Yeah, sure. So within this game, currently we have 4 what we call mini or sub-games. The idea is we'll build on this over time, but we started with these 4. So Make a Splash, it was originally called Park Builder, because that's primarily what you're required to do, is to actually design a water park. Hence maybe Wet and Wild, there's another theme park that could be included here. So this touches on aspects around shape manipulation, abstract reasoning, and I think still remains quite face valid. Yeah, you can look at that and you can understand why I'm being asked to do this and how it's potentially measuring future job performance, as an example. Balloon Blast, what you're required to do here is pop a number of balloons. You're raising money for charity. And this is touching on lower level cognitive things such as attention, cognitive speed. We've even introduced a little bit of cognitive Stroop as well to tap into some of those more cognitive based processes that are relevant in the workplace. Short circuits is an interesting one. It's derived fairly closely to the block design test of the WAIST, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is arguably the best known measure of intelligence around. And then tricky tokens, you're actually asked to test out some arcade games, which as a kid I remember being really cool, fun. And this is heavily emphasising numerical reasoning, which I guess the others don't touch on that much as well.
Also some visual object shapes and groupings and things like that.
Yep, spot on. So, it's all fun and games, it sounds great, but I guess what we also had to do, as Sally touched on before, is attempt to try to bridge that divide between what's fun and engaging in a practical sense, but also what works scientifically, and that's the whole process of validation. So validation itself obviously is concerned with validity, i.e. proving or demonstrating the practical worth of this type of tool, i.e. is it predicting something. So in this particular context, we're talking specifically about job performance. So to get there, to arrive at some validity evidence, there's a variety of steps that we undertook. The first 2, game design, was all about getting SMEs, subject matter experts, involved, which we did, quite a diverse number, as I said before. And then testing that in a pilot setting, i.e. it was one-on-one proctoring, where we actually had real-time feedback. We would sit there with someone playing the game and get their feedback straight up. And that helped us modify the game over time and iterate a variety of versions over time to arrive at a game that we thought actually was fairly valid. We had some confidence now that if we tested this empirically, we would prove that the models we had were actually working. Okay.
One of the things that we kind of said in the team was, does it make your brain hurt? And if you could feel your brain hurting while you were doing it, we knew we were doing something right.
That's right,
So that was
right.
one of the kind of acceptance tests in our mind during the pilot phase.
Yes. So the first phase of validation, what we actually got was a very large sample of real candidates. So these guys are applying for real jobs. So none of this white coat lab study stuff here at Rebellion. And that enabled us, with that data size anyway, to really arrive at models that allowed us to first identify how we would score these games, and then also whether those scores related to something of practical worth. And we were able to prove that. We were looking at, as I mentioned before, cognitive ability and general mental ability. So first phase validation allowed us to design those models. The second phase, where we actually used another very large sample of real job candidates, we were able to validate or cross-validate those particular models to ensure that irrespective of who's doing the test, it would work in a similar way. So when you look at validation, there's a number of ways of developing evidence, and it really is a journey. over time. So some of our assessments have been around 15 years. We're still collecting validation evidence on them. This is the start for Theme Park Hero, but I think it's a very strong start. So we have what's called construct validity. We have very strong links to things such as general mental ability. And as Sali's touched on also, I think it's very clear that we have content and face validity. It's very clear that we are measuring something that is relevant, and you can have some confidence, therefore it's going to predict what's important too.
Yeah, I think another important thing to mention during this, while we had psychometric validation going on, we were actually developing the analytics and the technical side that sat under this, and it was really using a mix of brand new technologies. So hats off to our engineering department that actually could support this process and allow us to actually measure something meaningful through this psychometric lens.
Yep, spot on. And I think through that validation phase, and certainly through some of that face validity that we captured, you can make fairly clear links to these lower level cognitive capacities. So we have construct validity at a high level, but it's quite clear that we're touching on things such as mental agility, which I believe is quite pervasive across all 4 of the games. As I said before, attention, Balloon Blast uses that quite well. Cognitive speed, again, is across all 4. Spatial aptitude, you can see that quite clearly in short circuits, and numerical processing abilities touched on with tricky tokens as well. So in time, we can kind of build on these components and really upscale our reporting as well. But I think if you have a look at all those are abilities that you can make a strong argument are relevant for a large variety of job types and job industries as well. What we've done at this particular stage, though, is we actually arrive at an overall score on this measure. So candidates complete this tool, and it taps in on each of those underlying cognitive components. We've developed models and scoring models, therefore, that allow us to group them together to arrive at a final score, a percentile score. And we tend to recommend the use of this tool really at any point of the selection process, but generally I think it can be used and potentially most useful at the early stage, right? To use it at the early stage of a recruitment process. Certainly if you're recruiting large numbers of candidates, I don't believe there's any harm, in fact, getting a large number of those guys to complete the game. And certainly, as we would suggest and recommend with all our tools, all our assessment tools, that is they be used as complementary tools. So this is a game that can be used alongside your standard traditional measures, which, when used appropriately, are also quite powerful. Your interviews, assessment centres and such things too. And it can be used as a complementary tool to other assessments as well, which we've built into our products over the years, and allows you to arrive at what we call a suitability score at the end that combines them all together. So if you want any more information on that, we'll throw up our contact links at the end, and we can discuss that further too.
What's really cool about this is that that experience or that journey doesn't now stop at attraction. We carry through to selection. When you're recruiting people, now you can offer them that full-blown experience that's modern, unique, and they can feel engaged in the recruitment process. So it's a continuation of this gamification process that we can apply now to testing as well.
Sure. Yep. As I mentioned, this is really just the start of the journey for us. So there's a lot more things that we plan to do. As I touched on before, I believe there's certainly a lot more traits that we can be measuring, not only from the existing games that we've got, and there are indications we are touching on things such as personality. If you look at Big Five, there's some indications towards personality that we can tap into and build on. But the idea being that over time we're going to build more games, and we'll build games that allow us to gather greater insight and unique insight in addition to cognitive components. We're looking at personality, even a bit of emotional intelligence, safety attributes and attitudes too. So that'll be our focus in the short to medium term.
Sure.
Benchmarking is another feature that we have available, very shortly we'll have available, that allows you to actually have current employees complete the game, allows you to benchmark, get an understanding of their performance, and have new recruits, new candidates compared to that benchmark, with the hope that they'll meet that benchmark and potentially exceed it over time. Analytics kind of just taps into new ways of behavioural modelling. You've heard the term big data, I'm sure. We're keen on taking as much advantage as we can from all the data that we capture from these games, i.e. 10,000 data points or so per gameplay is a lot of data, and we're looking at adopting new techniques to better use that data.
And there's a mountain of it. We have a mountain of data with having a number of candidates have gone through this already very quickly. And as Jason mentioned, we're really trying to look at different models of different behavioural traits or markers within the data that help us identify different things. And we already have indications that, you know, different players take on unique roles when they're completing these games, and that certainly relates to different types of personality traits. So it's just the start for us. And, you know, with this assessment, we're going to grow the capability more, and you might see different types of reporting and all different types of things coming in, and this assessment will continually grow and develop as we move forward.
We actually went live, i.e. made it available to the market about a month ago, and the numbers we're seeing are actually quite encouraging too. So we're upwards of close to 1,000 now that have done the game, and that's across a variety of some of our bigger clients, tier 1 clients. And so with that, what we're able to also do is to grow our comparison groups. So we'll be looking at more specific comparison groups, whether they be industry or management or even grad comparison groups as well. That will be available for the use of this game ongoing in the near future too. Yep. Sure. All right. I think that brings us to the end.
It does. Yes. Thank you. If you've stayed with us till the end, thank you so much for listening.
Yes.
If you do have any questions, or if you have any things that you'd like to talk about, you can definitely contact us directly. Reach out over Twitter, Revelian Co. Link up with us on LinkedIn, and also go to our website and you can submit inquiries. Definitely reach out, have a discussion with us. This is brand new territory in the assessments space, so we're more than excited to talk about it and answer any questions that you might have. So thank you for joining us. It's been our pleasure to take you through gamification and Theme Park Hero as a whole. We'll look forward to getting in touch with you.
Thank you. Bye now.